Hi, my name is Jarad Greene, and I'm a cartoonist. And today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what I do for a living and show you how I work, how I got to where I am, and all that good stuff. So, making comics for a living is a really cool job, and sometimes those comics come out online, sometimes they get printed in the newspaper, like here on the cover of 7 Days. Sometimes they also come out as books, like my very first graphic novel, Scullion, A Dishwasher's Guide to Mistaken Identity. And all of these comics go through relatively the same process. So I'm going to show you some of the steps to, how it gets to its final form. So a little about how I got to where I am. I was a kid who loved to write and draw all the time. I was also always reading books and comics in the newspaper, and I just always had a sketchbook with me. I would draw in the car, I would draw at restaurants, I would draw on family vacations, I would draw inside, outside, everywhere. I just loved to draw, and I couldn't be stopped. And I certainly never thought that I would get to do it for a living, but all of that time spent drawing has sort of prepared me for this career. And when I was in high school, I got really lucky in that my high school had a student newspaper called Revolution, and I worked as a cartoonist on the newspaper staff for 3 years during high school. And then when I went to college, my college newspaper also had a student newspaper called the Daily Gamecock, so I drew cartoons for them as well. And I did all different kinds of cartoons. I did editorial cartoons, which are comics that support the editorial position of the paper that week. I did editorial illustrations, which is just story art that accompanies an article. And then I also had a comic strip, which was gag-based, and that came out twice a week. And so that was amazing, like, training ground for the work that I do now, and then I was just constantly drawing and writing, honing my craft, and every week being published and like seeing my work in print and evaluating it and trying to do better the next week, and just doing that for 4 years straight in college really helped me get some great habits of writing and drawing almost every single day. All of these different comics, they usually go through about the same process, so I'm going to show you some of the steps that I take in order to get my comics from an idea in my head into their final form. When it comes to Scullion, my graphic novel, how I started was that I wrote an outline of the whole story. So each of these lines in this grid are a different scene in the story, and I have to hit all of these scenes and put them together in order to make a complete book. Sometimes I'll take this and I will write basically an essay of the beginning, middle, and end of the story. All of the events that happen, everything that has to be in this book in order for it to make sense and for the characters to have sort of satisfying conclusions. So once I have this completed, I will start doing what's called thumbnails, which are just rough sketches of the final version of the book. So this is where I also write the dialogue. Some cartoonists, this in this huge binder, you can see that I collected all of my thumbnails to kind of keep them organized. But some cartoonists like to write scripts out, but I'm somebody who just likes to draw and write the dialogue at the same time. So you can see these are my like rough pencil versions of this whole book. And you can flip through this entire thing and see the whole book. Now I don't do this all in one sitting. It takes me a while to get all of these collected. So I just do a little bit every day until it's all done. And from there, I would pencil the pages on my iPad. And from there, I will print them out on Bristol paper, which is just like a heavy cardstock paper. And I will ink them so that I can make the final art. And I ink my work with a bottle of ink and a brush that I dip in, and I carefully outline each pencil drawing. This is so that it reproduces really clearly. The pencil can be kind of a little too light to reproduce. And from there, I will scan those inked drawings into the computer and clean them up, and then I will add color. So you can see these are the final pages as they appeared in the book. And again, I just do this one at a time, little by little, until the whole book is done. It took me about a year to do this entire book, and about a year prior to that of writing and thumbnailing. So like I said, it doesn't happen overnight, even though I wish I could work faster, but a little bit every day, and eventually you have a whole book. So as far as like a typical day, it really depends on where I'm at in this process of all those different steps that I just showed you. So I may be writing a project, and so in that case I'm working on my outline or synopsis, or I'm writing and drawing those thumbnails, and that'll just be the thing that I work on for that day. And usually I'm drawing in my sketchbook, especially if I'm designing characters. I want to be able to draw them as often as I can before I actually make the final artwork. That way it feels like second nature drawing them. For Scullion, I mean, I drew all of the characters in this book so many times in every single panel over and over again over the course of a year. And so prior to that, I had drawn those characters in my sketchbook hundreds of times, and so it just made it a lot easier when I was making the final artwork. So there's always a little bit of drawing, but usually it starts with the outlining and the thumbnailing, and then I will send that to an editor if I'm working with an editor. They'll give me feedback on anything that's unclear or needs to be updated, and then I'll make those changes, and then I will draw the final artwork. And again, I just draw a couple pages a week, and slowly building up until they're all done. Then I print them all out and do that process again, where I'm just inking them one at a time until they're all finished, scanning them all once they're finished, and then coloring them a little by little. And I had some help with the colors. Some friends of mine helped lay down the base colors, then I finished everything by making everything the final color and then adding shading and lighting effects and things like that. So depending on where I'm at, I'm doing one of those sort of tasks each day until it's all done. And then I send the book to my publisher, or I send in the cartoons to the newspaper editor or art director that I'm working for. They'll let me know if there's any final changes. They'll do proofreading if there's a lot of text. And yeah, and then it'll come out. And it's really exciting to hold it in your hands and to you know, to see it in person. And I also should say that I work a lot bigger than the final size of this book. So I worked 125% larger. It's just a little easier on my hand, which is good. If you're working on a 200-page book, you gotta preserve the tool that makes it happen. That's pretty much it. If you're somebody who loves writing and drawing, if you love storytelling really in any form, this could be the ideal career for you. It's something you have to work really independently and be self-motivated to do it. Especially when I'm developing a project, I may not have a contract to be published or anybody who's asking me to do it, but I just have a desire to write and tell stories, and I love doing it. And so I just make it happen because that's just part of my job. And so if you are self-motivated and love to tell stories, then you would be a great fit for this career. You do have to work by yourself a lot of the time, and then you work with other people depending on where you're at in the process. Part of what I love about this job is that really anything that is in my head, I can put it onto the page. Any idea for an illustration or an important topic that I feel compelled to write or draw about, I finally have the skills now over many years to take something out of my head and put it down onto paper, which is just a really exciting thing to do, and to be able to tell a story, any kind of story that I want. It could be a contemporary story set in our real world, or it could be a fantasy adventure or sci-fi, and a western, a globe-trotting sort of thing, and really anything is on the table, and that's such an exciting thing to be able to do. And yeah, I just love it. I never sort of know where my interests are going to lead me, and getting to do this for a living is just a really fun thing to do. I'm going to show you how to draw one of the characters from my book. I'm going to go through the penciling and the inking process and talk a little bit about how I think about designing characters. When you work on a graphic novel, there are a lot of characters to design, in addition to all the environments, backgrounds, costumes, props. All of that has to be designed, and if you're writing and drawing your own project, you're the one that has to do it. So I'll talk a little bit about how I work and how I think about character design while showing you how I draw. I'm going to draw the character Grubble, who is one of the troublemaking trolls of my story. So every character just basically breaks down into basic shapes. And in the case of Grubble, he has kind of a rounded square face. When it comes to designing characters, it's really important that they are all distinct from one another so that it doesn't get confusing in your story, and whenever you see those distinct shapes, you know exactly who you're looking at. So if you think of like Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck, those cartoons are really well known, but they have very distinct shapes, so we recognize them instantly. So that's what I try to go for. Instant recognizability. It's kind of this funky chin and this squared off jaw. So giving them distinct shapes, sometimes you think about whether the character looks similar to other characters or different, and you can use those things for different effects. My book Scullion deals with mistaken identity, so I have two characters that actually look kind of similar to one another, and that serves the story. Grubble has these big round eyes. So Grubble's kind of like short and squat, has a lot of squarish shapes. One of the other characters, May, is super round. And then there's characters that are taller, shorter, this whole mix of different characters together make for a really interesting and diverse world. So I try to go for that. Actually, I might change his expression a little bit since he's usually scheming around. I'm gonna give him kind of a raised eyebrow. He always has a kind of a funny expression. So I keep things pretty loose. I do draw on the computer sometimes, but I love just working on paper. This is just a plain color pencil that's erasable. Nothing too fancy. I actually love working in colored pencil because if they are a little bit harder to erase, but I think that forces you to try out different ideas and see where it takes you if you don't have the option of erasing every 5 seconds, or the power of the undo button on the computer can be a little overwhelming. So I don't want to spend too long on this so this video doesn't take forever, but he wears a backwards baseball cap, and I'll just draw the collar of his shirt and his neck. Here we go. Like I said, I've drawn him a million times, so I'm very fast at drawing him. It may take you a bit longer when you're first drawing a character, and certainly I drew lots of variations of him before I actually settled on this design. Didn't happen all at once. So there we go. I have a basic sketch of him down. I can see all of my main lines. This central line is kind of a guideline so that I know where to place his eyes and his nose and his mouth so that it doesn't look sort of out of whack. And then I can place all the other features pretty easily. And again, lots of big shapes, so squarish head, round eyes, kind of a rounded nose, rounded ears, these big bulbous things for his hair, keeping it pretty simple. Over here I have my brush that I'm going to ink with, and I have a glass of water to dip the brush in because you want the bristles to move pretty easily, and then my jar of ink. And I'm just going to dip my brush in about halfway, just don't need too much ink. Then I have this scrap paper over here where I can do what's called tipping the brush. So this gives it a nice point and gets off any of the excess ink. And I usually start somewhere on the face. That way if I mess up, I haven't inked the entire thing. I've only inked the face, which I think is the most important part. So part of why I love working with a brush is that I can get thin and thick lines without having to switch tools. And each time I dip the brush in the ink stays on the brush for a decent amount of time, so I'm not constantly stopping. Like that. When it comes to circles, it's always easier to do them in 2 strokes. If it's not thick enough, I can just go back over it. And I move the paper all the time, whatever angle I need it to be at in order to easily get the lines that I want to make. Some people like to tape theirs down. I don't. I like moving it around. Now I'm working pretty large, so I'm running out of ink a little faster than I normally would when I'm inking a bunch of tiny panels. Part of why I like to work bigger, like I mentioned, is because if it was all really small, I'd be really cramped and trying to squeeze my hand to ink really tiny panels. And over time, that gets very uncomfortable. It took me a long time to sort of get used to working with a brush. I used what are called technical pens for a long time, which are basically just like a writing pen, essentially, that has black ink in it. And I used those for my newspaper comics for many years. I've used brush pens, which have like a refillable capsule inside them, so you don't have to have a bottle of ink and you can travel with them easily. One thing I'm thinking about while I'm inking is having some of the bigger, more outlined shapes on the edge of his face be thicker than his facial features. This helps give the character like some weight when he has these sort of outer, heavier lines, and then inside it's a little thinner. I tend to get really quiet sometimes when I'm inking because I just get in the zone and I tune everything else out, and it doesn't matter if I'm listening to music or a podcast. I just, at a certain point, I just forget that I'm even listening to anything. Sometimes if I'm listening to a podcast, whoever's being interviewed might give a really good answer, and I'm like, oh, that's so interesting. Wait, what was the question? I find myself having to rewind and go back because I've just completely tuned it out. Luckily, this ink that I'm using dries pretty quickly. Otherwise, I might be smudging it all over the place, although that is why we have whiteout. I definitely used a lot of whiteout when making Scullion. I have a pretty smooth line style. There's definitely lots of artists who have more of a rougher, more textured style, who like to use dry brush or maybe different kinds of pens or paints that produce a different line. But I like this kind of smoother style. Ooh, I think it was smeared. You work with a brush, you do have to kind of go quickly and work. Oh, oops. See, I just smeared it. I'll have to wipe that out. you do have to work kind of quickly, because if you work too slow, then if you're a little unsteady with your hands, the brush will pick up all the jitteriness, which could be something that you're into, but I try to have a more confident, smooth line. I'm also jumping around a lot. Normally I would work left to right, so that way I'd be in less danger of smearing everything. But we're just gonna go with it. It's a quick sketch. I love to put this shadow under a character's face, a shadow on their neck. Kind of makes it feel really solid and helps their head sort of pop a bit. Depending on the scene, I might add a lot of shadow if it's a really dark area, or if it's at night. Just depends on what I'm going for. And some of the shadow in his underside of his hat. There we go. There you have it. All I have to do is find a pen. Ooh, pen that works, maybe. The danger of being an artist is that I have a lot of pens and a lot of them don't work. Here we go. And this is Grubble. I hope you all enjoyed getting a sneak peek into my process, and you can see all you need is a piece of paper, a pencil, and something to ink with, and you're ready to make your own comics. So I hope you will give it a try.